I need a nap between open and then like go into the sleep after.
Yeah, I thought I was not gonna get out of this.
But
Yoga again or no?
I have my final sleep, but if he's making like know all of the systems to mechanisms and powerful factors, I think it's an
He
ATA.
probably.
No.
Oh, wow. No, ours is only getting.
But he made us do the two-step
Right.
mechanism, like both the steps of like, mercury one.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna go as far as we can get. But for sure, we want to at least get to humans. So last time when we were talking, we had finished up looking at the differences between monotremes, our marsupials, and our placental mammals, our eutherians. And we had noted that one of the main differences between our marsupials and placental mammals is that while both give live birth, our placental mammals have a really long development in utero and so give birth to better developed babies. And we had talked about how we primates are placental mammals. And we had walked through a little bit of the differences in different groups of primates. Okay, so now we're going to walk through some of the stuff in time. So here is a time dated sort of picture of the tree of primates. So starting in the Paleocene. So we are now in the Cenozoic era. And we're looking at some of the periods within it. We're going to step through a couple of these branches, but orienting ourselves to some of the groups we looked at last time. So our lemurs are over here in a group with things like slow lorises. I don't know if you've ever seen lorises, but there's sometimes videos of people like tickling their armpits, which is a little mean, but also cute. So they're often their own branch over here. These are prosimians, sometimes also included in that group are tarsiers, although we think now that these are more towards our own lineage. We talked about the differences between the New World monkeys and the Old World monkeys. So the New World monkeys living in South America with their prehensile tails, and Old World monkeys living everywhere else, I guess. Let's say Africa and Asia mostly. And then our own group are the apes. So in terms of the fossil record, our oldest primate-like mammals are the Plesiodeiforms. So here's our Cenozoic timeline, by the way. Okay, so we're starting at about 66 million years ago, going all the way to the present. So we start to see primates arguably near the beginning of the Cenozoic. Our Plesiodeiforms are the first mammals that we've found that seem to have fingernails instead of claws. So just like we do, have fingernails instead of claws. We think that this may be around the time that we see a dietary shift to fruits and leaves in these groups. That might have something to do with the shift from claws to fingernails, but this is still something that's kind of under debate as people debate why primates evolved. Moving forward in time, crossing into the Eocene, we see two groups called the Adapids and the Omomyids. We're not going to talk about it for time, but just so you know, there is actually a cool event climatically between the Paleocene and the Eocene. There's a really big shift that's kind of analogous to global warming So there's a thermal maximum, like a spike in temperature between these two time periods, which is part of why they're separated. So the Edaphids and Omomiids are arising, I think, after this climatic shift. So something that we see in both groups is that they have forward-oriented eyes. So we talked about stereoscopic vision last time. I pulled up some figures for us to look at that kind of again. But this means that we have basically a difference in what we can focus on, what we can see. Both of these groups are arboreal, which should not be that surprising since we got a pretty squirrel-like thing as our first potential primate earlier on. We're arboreal, but now we are looking forward. So the differences between the two are, there are lots of skeletal details, which we're not going to go into, but the Edaphids are probably ancestral to things like lemurs. So that's technically a group called the Strepsirrhini, which, fun fact, it has wet noses. That's one thing that distinguishes them. The Omomiids are probably ancestral to the other part of the tree, the Haplorhines, which we are in as well. But in general, we got little crawly things, some differences in their skulls, some differences in their teeth, but we start to see this shift to facing forward, which is pretty cool. And here we see how we think that these animals were living around the Paleocene, Eocene thermal max. So here's a view of that visual field shift. So in animals like rabbits, we have mostly like monocular vision because they have eyes to either side. So this makes for a good visual field for prey species, because if you notice, they can actually see stuff kind of all the way around like this. So as they turn their heads, they got pretty much everywhere. What it doesn't do is give you a good ability to perceive depth or 3D motion, because you're really only seeing things with one eye. So you're basically getting a 2D picture for most of your visual field. And we can tell, by the way, in fossils, what kind of vision we would have because we can see the orbit. Okay. So here we have a lemur skull and an example of what the field of vision is kind of changing to as you start to see eyes that can point forward. So we still have regions where only one eye is seeing things, but for most of our field of vision, we can put things together in 3 dimensions. So we can do a lot of depth perception, which means we're better able to tell how far away things are, how far we have to reach for things. So this is a real change for what we can do. Because when you can see things in 3 dimensions, this is going to improve the ability to grasp things, especially. Yeah. I'm gonna go with that because we're about to talk about some of the theories for why we see this. So for things driving primate evolution, right, one important shift is this change in the eyes. And that's actually one of the differences between the Edaphids and the Omomiids. They're like specific structures around the orbit, like whether there's a post-orbital bar or not, which is why we're not going into it. But eyes are super important for primate evolution. So when we see this shift, part of what we want to know is kind of like why. So we have 3 kind of options for what we're doing with this 3-dimensional vision and like why we see this shift. The first one is the arboreal hypothesis, which suggests that these are traits evolving to improve locomotion. So how could 3-dimensional vision help you locomote? So that's like movement, how you get around in the world, right? What would vision have to do with that? Mhm. And why might you want to do that if you're a primate? Yeah. If you think about like monkeys or primates or lemurs are, right? We've got a lot of like jumping, and when we're in the trees, right, there are actually different ways you can move around trees, right? Like squirrels do a lot of running around on top of branches. So that's a kind of like quadrupedal arborealism. But we also have in our primates a fair amount of leaping and grasping going on. In the arboreal hypothesis, uh, part of the purpose of this 3D vision, the stereoscopic vision, the advantage here is that when you're moving around in the trees, this is going to help you like not fall. If you have bad depth perception and you're leaping from branch to branch, that's going to be a problem, especially if you get bigger too, right? If you're bigger, you fall harder. Okay. So the second hypothesis, which is somewhat more recent, although I will say the 1980s is not very recent anymore, is the visual predation hypothesis, which comes from the observation that like we are not the only animals that have our eyes pointing forward. Specifically, like carnivores have eyes that point forward, which makes them good predators for catching prey. So in this hypothesis, the suggestion is that this is kind of convergent evolution happening, that we have this same shift to forward pointing eyes for some type of predation. Now, our earliest primates are pretty small. So the suggestion here is that when we're talking predation, we're talking about maybe things like insects because of the practicalities of that kind of size scale here. The third hypothesis, because honestly, people did not very much like the idea of our earliest primates as predators for various reasons, is that what's happening here is a coevolution with the angiosperms. Okay. So remind me what an angiosperm is. Those are gymnosperms.
Flowering plants.
Yeah, flowering plants. So what do flowers turn into? Yeah, fruit. Okay. So as we're moving from the Mesozoic into the Cenozoic, the end of our last era, we saw the emergence of flowering plants. And flowers mean that we are now developing fruit. So in this angiosperm primate coevolution hypothesis, the idea is that the primates are adapting to take advantage of these fruits simply kind of high up in the trees, and that this depth perception is for creating the ability to kind of find and grasp those fruits in the visual field. Because like in a tree, you are going to have to kind of reach for it. You can't keep crawling directly up to the fruit if it's still on the branch, right? You have to be in it. So you do have to be able to kind of grasp it. So these are three ideas for why we're seeing this. Okay. So these are happening in this larger chunk of time called the Paleogene, which is made up of these periods. Now we're moving into the Miocene. So we mentioned this before, but the Miocene is cool because one thing that we see is an expansion in our ape groups. So what's included in the ape? Remind me. We have opposable thumbs. We have opposable thumbs in a fair number. These are primate characteristics. Yeah. I'm just asking for examples of fruit, actually. So like what's a species that's in seed? Yeah, great. Gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans are the ones we think most about. We also include gibbons if we expand out to our lesser apes. But a characteristic of apes is that they have no tail. They're getting larger. And as they get larger, our apes have larger brains. They're longer lived than our monkeys. So actually, I'm going to scroll this way back to that phylogeny at the beginning. All right, so our monkeys, our New World monkeys and our Old World monkeys, and the apes are coming out of the Old World monkeys, basically, the split here. Okay, so we see a loss of the tail, we see expansion of the brain, and we see a longer lifespan as this is happening. Now, we don't have that many groups, right, living today. We've got our chimps, and the chimps actually have a sister group in their same genus, the bonobos. Then we have our gorillas. There are a couple species of gorillas, orangutans, 2 species of orangutan. And then we have our gibbons, and that's it. But we see a real diversification of our ape groups in the Miocene in these kind of hot island climates, theoretically. And here we can see some of that diversification. All right. Coming out of our apes, along our own lineage, we're now going to move into our hominins. So we think our hominins are arising somewhere, I moved this arrow, right? Yeah, somewhere around here. We're thinking 3 to 6 million years ago. Exactly where we put the arrow depends on how we're tracing science and whose states we believe. So what do you think a hominin is going to be? What are some differences between us and the other apes?
Yeah. I guess if they have a language too, probably
Language. Yeah, it sure seems different, right? Mhm. Which is part of why we can learn, right? We can learn communicate well. That people say, right? We're Ouija boards, right?
I mean,
How's a gorilla going to communicate with a dead gorilla?
the ability, like, they use, like, their feet as a, like, extra set of hands and walk with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're doing different things with their hands and feet for sure. Yeah. And we saw how when we were looking at hands and feet, we saw how a bunch of primates kind of have like foot thumbs, right? Why do you think they have foot thumbs and we don't have foot thumbs? Mm-hmm. Why don't we have them if we're apes? Yeah, no, yeah, why don't we have them if we are apes? Sure. So let's go through it though. Let's think, right? So some things in life, right, are like use it or lose it. But in evolution, it doesn't always work that way, right? Like a trait doesn't necessarily need to be like actively maintained for you to still have it, right? Like we got some tailbones, we got an appendix. We have various like vestigial traits still. So why couldn't we keep a foot thumb?
Is it because, like,
Just uncomfy in our shoes?
I was gonna say, it's because we developed, like, the ability to be faster, like, when we, like, use the bottom.
And why are we
For
faster?
a while.
Oh, that's what we do.
So, maybe because they walk on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't walk on all fours. So actually, everybody stand up for a second. No, you're not gonna have to stand up. Boy, it's gonna be super easy. It's not you to feel your foot. Like take a couple steps and feel your foot. Like feel how you're walking. And think about your big toe. Uh-huh. And actually,
Oh,
notice.
toe the forward thumb.
Your big toe is the forward thumb, and like, notice when you step forward, what are you like pushing off the ground there? Right, so like, try and walk and like lift your big toe, like don't put it on the ground. You're like kind of wobbling, right? Yeah, and some of our other apes, like they can walk, right? But if you see a gorilla walk,
Yeah.
it does like this.
That's huge. though. They got a couple 100 pounds on us.
Yeah. That too.
I'm in a football. They kind of waddle like that.
Yeah, you know.
Man,
Depends what hurts too, right? Like, my dad has to go to the bathroom. That's a funny walk. Anyway, so we did lose our thumb toe, but that gets to one of the big differences between us and the other apes is that bipedalism, right? So that's directly linked to the lack of an opposable toe because of the way we walk. Our big toe is actually super important for locomotion because it helps us push off and be really efficient. We basically got like our foot has turned into a spring, right? That's why it's so much stiffer and can't grab. So it's true that the other apes have adapted their feet for climbing. They're really good at grabbing. They can use them. We've done something totally different with our foot in that we've made it like a rigid, bouncy lever so that we don't use much energy when we push off the ground. We kind of swing like a pendulum. We have a lot of other changes that we see in the foot associated with that. There's ligaments, there's arches, all sorts of things. Like apes would be really like flat-footed too. But looking at that big toe is one of our pieces of evidence when we're looking for shifts towards bipedalism and towards more efficient bipedal locomotion, is it's actually really important to kind of pull that in and be able to use that push. Okay. So we do have a number of hominin characteristics. So when we're thinking about our own lineage, one of the things that we focus on often is that change to bipedal locomotion because it's super obvious, right? When you see chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans, that they're climbing around in the trees. When they're on the ground, they're kind of like sitting or often moving on all fours, although they can kind of waddle. And as we see that shift to bipedalism, we do see some of these other things that you were mentioning, right? Like we can talk. Language is an adaptation that we have to what degree other species can communicate, right? Like birds have like calls, right? So exactly what you want to call a language can be debated, but we definitely do have a really advanced form of communication, especially always advancing, right? Like since we can write, we got the internet, we got email, right? Like lots and lots and lots of language development going on, which is associated with culture too. Often, and this is also part of some really currently very like hot and loud scientific debates are about the cultural sort of associations of humans and especially modern humans. In modern humans, one of the things that they focused on in the past is like deliberately burying your dead is something that we thought was something specific to modern humans. So they would like look at graves and try and figure out where they put there on purpose, or did they just like fall into a cave? This is an argument. So it was a big deal when they found like a Neanderthal grave with like flowers that appear to have been deliberately placed there, right? Because this was considered something that was just us. Art and fire are considered, you know, like very advanced towards our lineage. So currently there's a really new human group that's been found, Homo naledi, which is older than we thought. It's relatively primitive looking, relatively small brain, It's in a deep, deep, deep cave that's really hard to get into in South Africa. But they've sent some cavers down into it. They actually specifically sent out a call for anthropologists and paleontologists with like rock climbing experience. And specifically, they were looking for like people who were small enough to go into this cave. So it ended up like just like a bunch of like very tiny women were basically who they were selecting for to go into this cave because that's who could get into there, which was kind of funny. But they recently found, right, like what they interpret as like torch marks on the walls of the cave. So they're implying that there's like fire down in there. And there's some formations that they have been considering to be some form of art down there. And they published this paper kind of without peer review. Like they put it out there on a journal that like publishes the paper and then lets people comment like after it's already out there. And they said they did it so that the finds could get out there really fast, which is helpful and cool. But there's been a bit of a backlash because people have been pointing out that like a bunch of their claims, had they gone through peer review, they would have been asked to like actually support. Maybe not necessarily the best supported claims, specifically those ones about like the fire and the art, which is not to say that they're not true, just that they don't necessarily have the evidence and haven't done the tests that you would want to do before you say that, right? Like that's the kind of thing that you can, you know, say on your YouTube or in your TikTok or your news article, but like if you're going to publish it in a scientific paper, you have to have rigorous evidence, and they maybe only have YouTube amounts of evidence at this point.
Have a question.
Mhm.
Like, do you think maybe because we develop like fire, we stop like having like, a lot of like harm?
Mm,
Because I mean, like for normal like keeping warm, because we develop like another sort of like keeping us warm and we lost.
fire and like clothes also, right? Um, yes, but we also see, you know, less for earlier in our lineage. So there are some discussions about that. Usually what people suggest is that this actually also kind of has to do with the bipedalism potentially. Because what's the point of fur? You're like,
Thermal regulation.
yeah, but also it's like it's for thermal regulation and it's trapping that air in there, right? It's making it hot, right? So one of the ideas is that we're losing hair as a different form of thermoregulation because what do we do to thermoregulate? Like if you're on a run or something. Yeah, we sweat. We have that evaporative cooling. So part of the idea, at least the beginnings of the loss of hair are about like if you're now bipedal and you're like running around on 2 feet, maybe you're getting really hot. Some of the ideas about like why we became bipedal had to do with evolving in a hot climate specifically. And some people have even suggested that like if you're standing upright, the sunlight would mostly like hit your head, which also like I don't know, makes you red hot or something. But yeah, maybe the more recent continued loss of hair, right? It could start for one reason and then continue for another reason. You know? Yeah.
Why did like Homo erectus so like tall? Is it just because he is, or like was there actually like was he that tall? Like why is there
Why they made it this tall in this specific picture, I'm not sure, but no, but like our fossils do vary in size a lot, and there is one that is particularly large. So I suspect that's why that it's based on like that fossil. But larger than others. So we're talking about- Okay, bipedalism, right? And associated with bipedalism, we have an upright posture, which when you look at a picture, that doesn't necessarily seem that important, right? But if you think about what this does to like your spine, it actually does make a difference. And it's kind of part of why we have back problems a lot in people, like, and chronic back problems, and back problems are really prevalent, right? Because if you're kind of on all fours, right, you can have your head, you can have like your spine. I guess I'm drawing an ape, so I'm not going to draw a tail. So we're going to have some hips, and you got your legs, right? Okay. And we do have some curvature to the spine, but like maybe more kind of in an arc, right? Something like that. But if you're upright, what we've done with our spine in order to hold our head up is we've created a series of curves, right? So we got like a curve, curve, curve thing going on. I do that backwards. I think I drew one too many curves. Sorry. Okay, let's go like that, right? So our posture is more like that. Okay. So this addition of curvatures basically means that when we're supporting our body mass, right, like these curves kind of help you stabilize back and forth. You can swing kind of back and forth. You can keep yourself upright pretty well. But if you think about the pressures, right, when you're holding your body weight here and you've got this curvature before you go to your pelvis, right, you're not actually supporting yourself up and down on like a rod of bone. So this is part of why we have issues with like disc flipping and herniated discs and all that kind of stuff, is that we've made a change to the spine that is helpful for being upright and keeping that stability and flexibility in an upright position, but it kind of makes our backs like weak a little bit. It creates some kind of pinch points to it. So,
So, we filled out like a temperature check at the beginning of the year. So, like, I don't know any of the, like, I don't want to.
Yeah.
Like, I still don't know either. Like, is this evolution, like, called hard facts, like what science says, is like how we came to be?
which part specifically?
Like, just how we arrived from, like, the ape, the Homo erectus, so, we now, like, that, like, is that evidence, like, in science prove that? I guess you can't prove anything, but is that what it, like, saw through the sports?
Yeah, basically. There are arguments about like which specific fossils would or wouldn't be part of our lineage. The ones, the Homo erectus is pretty solidly in our own, but basically the reason it's such solid support is that we do see a pretty clear like gradual transition of traits going back to basically the Miocene age. We start to see, like we were just like feeling our toes, right? The earliest structures for bipedalism we have, like they actually still kind of have a toe out like that. We have tracks of bipedal things kind of walking this way, and then we see the toe changing shape, and coming like gradually in. We see like a gradual expansion of the brain case. They actually make, it's pretty cool. They make what they're called endopaths. And so like you can take a skull and basically kind of like pour an imaginary mold in it and like recreate the brain that there would have been. And we can see gradual changes in that kind of leading us towards our own structure. So yeah, that's why it's such solid support. So in the past, like when this was originally so controversial, like something people were sometimes looking for was like the missing link. Like if we evolved, right? Like where is the like half monkey man, right? I don't think there's not like one missing, but we do have it, right? And we even have basically sister groups kind of around the same time. So things that are dated to the same time as modern humans that we can also kind of trace that. So in order to not believe this, like you have to come up with some other kind of explanation for that. And there kind of isn't one that's not like a conspiracy, right? Like any other explanation for the fossil record that we see involves like making up people like pointing evidence or something like that, you know what I mean? Which it is kind of clearly not true when you can now see like videos of like people like discovering these things in caves and stuff. Does that make sense? I don't want to attack anyone's beliefs either, which is why I'm being careful here. Although, yeah, nobody in their survey seemed like they were going to feel particularly attacked. Which, you know, y'all chose to take this class, so I guess it's maybe not that surprising. But yeah, scientific consensus, which is not to say that there weren't some hoaxes, right? Like the Victorians were up to stuff, and they did like to occasionally like make kids sausage and take shells and try and pass them. But at this point, we have so many, so they're definitely not. And we caught them at it. So, upper posture, bipedalism, language, and the brain stuff. So we do have larger and more powerful brains. And there's actually like, I didn't pull it up on here, but when you're thinking about brain size, like there's a relationship with like how big something is and its brain size. And I'm definitely not gonna create a perfect chart. Because just as an animal gets bigger, it kind of naturally gets a bit of a bigger brain because the brain case is bigger. It means, you know, more neurons to like innervate more of its body, right? You still have to like feel all the different patches of your body and all your organ systems and stuff like that. So in mammals, there's a pretty clear relationship between increases in body mass and increases in brain size. Okay. But what happens is that a couple of species like pop out of this regression line. So if the data are like, you know, a regression is basically just like the line that best fits their stuff, right? So if data points for other mammals are kind of like this, which they are, right? We pop out like kind of like that, right? So when we say that we have larger and more powerful brains, this is even accounting for other factors that we know affect brain size, right? So it's that we can like also predict how big our brain should be, and our brain is even bigger than that. But actually, modern humans aren't the biggest brain of the species in our life, which is kind of interesting. Cool. I think there's some evidence that our brains are like shrinking recently, which is that doesn't sound great at the face of it, but brains also aren't always about just mass, right? Like and how large it is. The fact that our brains are all foldy, right, makes a difference too, because it's about surface area and interconnection as well. It's not just body. But our ability to use our brains is also linked in with that language and culture, planning, thinking, tool use. Chimpanzees do like hunting tools, like other animals will like take sticks and poke them into holes and get insect stuff. And they can teach each other to do that to a degree as well. But the ability to make larger and more powerful and more intricate tools and develop them over time is kind of tracing along with that change to the brain as well. So going to locomotion, when we look for the last common ancestor of us and other apes, which we sometimes want to do because we want to think about like, okay, so like, why did we diverge, right? Like, why are we different? And that's still open to debate, right? Like the fact that we are related to other apes, right? We can see that in the DNA, we can see a gradual kind of transition in the fossil record, right? We've got that, but we don't have a concrete, for sure answer to why that happened. One of the things we look at is like, okay, so bipedalism is one of the big changes, and since we can see bipedalism so clearly, sometimes people argue that bipedalism is even kind of driving some of these later changes, because the shift to bipedalism kind of happens earlier. And when you shift to bipedalism, it's actually like changes where the foramen magnum is. So like the hole at the base of your skull going to your spinal cord. And you can see that you now do have like really good physical support for a head, right? If you're holding your head like that, you have to support it a lot with your neck, right? But now we've got head straight over shoulders, right? So maybe we can support more. Anyway, so because this is one of the earliest traits and we're trying to think about why this happened and we're interested in why did we diverge, when did we diverge? Sometimes we think about, okay, so like what was the last ancestor like? What were they doing? So a thing that our two closest relatives do, we do not, is something called knuckle walking. So I'm going to try it. I'm going to be horrible at it, but what we're looking at here, right, is how a chimpanzee kind of holds its hands to walk, because they're not walking like on all fours with their palms flat on the ground. Like what they do is they're kind of bracing their wrists like this, putting their knuckles out and using that to walk. And you can see that pretty clearly in bone. And because we see this same kind of type of locomotion in both chimpanzees and gorillas, there are arguments that the last common ancestor of us and them might have been doing something like this, but that is a hot debate, right? Like whether there is evidence for that is something people have strong feelings about. So it's like, well, two out of three of these branches see this, so maybe it was ancestral. So then there are debates about like, are gorillas really doing it the exact same way as the chimpanzees, or is it convergent? Do we see any traces of these knuckle walking traits in our fossil lineage? I think currently the prevailing, the side that's winning is no. But it's very much a discussion that exists and like something that people are interested in kind of like looking for, because it has implications for what did our history look like, right? Did we come straight out of a tree and come onto the ground and become bipedal, or were we doing something like this, wandering around on the floor, knuckle walking, and then somehow saw a shift? That's something people are interested in. Okay, I think I have a picture of it later. I'll show it later. Okay. So some theories about how we evolved and why we started to see this shift have to do with climate changes basically. So around the time we start seeing at least some of these fossils in our lineage appearing, we start to see an environment in Africa, which is where our oldest human fossils are, becoming drier and patchier. So we start out with something kind of wet and green and lush and forested, and then we start to see drying up, patchy environments, hotter environments over time. So the savanna hypothesis suggests that the drier habitats are kind of pushing us towards bipedalism. Why do you think people say that? What would a drier habitat have to do with walking on two legs? Mhm. Mhm. So there's just nothing to climb on, but why not run around on all fours like a chimpanzee or a gorilla?
Well, this is kind of hard.
Mhm. Yeah.
Do them all four down, just to, just to say,
Right, and that's kind of related to ideas about like why the lack of fur, right? Um, Bipedalism is really like energetically efficient, actually. So the idea here is that like this helped us get from tree patch to tree patch for like where the fruits were, that as we had to travel longer distances, right? Like we're really good at distance.
it's right.
Mhm.
So I was gonna say maybe this is like faster, like,
Mhm.
like break it down, but then I was thinking, maybe you have like the faster than like the cheetah and stuff, and like, you know, like.
Yeah.
But they have like different
Mhm.
structure, so I was wondering if we were actually faster, like, even if you're not, like, because of the nothing.
Yeah, fluctuate. So when it comes to hunting, right, like cheetahs are really fast, but that takes a lot of energy, right? So they're also kind of sprinters, basically, right? Like they can go really fast and then they have to stop, right? So when you think about humans, when we think about like our hunting, we're often like called, like kind of like pursuit hunters, right? So the reason I use the word efficient instead of fast, right, is that like sometimes a little faster, but like also about the endurance piece, matters, right? Like to go far, you don't necessarily have to go fast. You just have to be able to keep going and have enough energy to keep going.
Yeah, maybe like go more like more spread out.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
dry, like weather, but they have to walk.
Mhm. Yeah, and like if a gorilla or a chimpanzee walk, right? Like they walk like this, right? And it actually takes a lot of muscle strength, right? They have to like really use their leg muscles, and that just like takes a lot of energy. But like, how long can you stand around? Like a really long time, right? I mean, I hate it, but but you can. So part of bipedalism is about like endurance. Yeah. So that's the savanna hypothesis. And this isn't like exactly the right time period, but these images I chose because I think it's kind of cool that the savanna basically used to be like a jungle or a rainforest. It goes through cycles where it becomes desert and becomes wet and becomes desert. So something like that kind of thing. Directly opposing that, we have the forest hypothesis. Here's where I got our orangutan pictures. Okay. So like our tree for relatedness among our great apes is we got orangutans, and then we have gorillas branching off, and we have chimps and bonobos, which are in the same genus, and us here. Okay. So for knuckle walkers, right, the reason there's a question about our last common ancestor being a knuckle walker is we've got gorillas here, we got chimps here, and they both knuckle walk. What the orangutans do is different, right? So they can sometimes come down to the ground. When they do that, they actually like kind of like fist walk. Like instead of being on their knuckles, they'll walk kind of like this. So, but most of what they do, they're really arboreal. They do something called quadrumanous climbing. So quadru for four, manus for hands. So they're doing a bunch of, slow grasping to everything. And here you can see in this tree, all right, so we're arboreal here, this orangutan. And so we kind of look like it's standing, right? Just like in the trees though, right? So in the forest hypothesis, the idea is that bipedalism actually did evolve in some of these forested environments as we slowly became upright in the tree, something like what the orangutans are doing, because they also have a kind of upright posture as they swing from tree to tree and kind of climb around in this manner. I mean, obviously not this guy on the telephone wire. that's a special situation. And it's kind of cool when we look at skeletal characteristics in the upper limb of humans and orangutans. There are some really kind of like surprising similarities between like shoulders and stuff in orangutans and like human fossils. So that's kind of interesting. Although the other question is like, did gorilla and chimpanzee knuckle walking kind of like override that, right? Like maybe our last common ancestors here doing something like orangutans, and then gorillas and chimpanzees is all knuckle walking. But looking at the tree, if our tree is right, what's the problem here if like orangutans and humans and the last common ancestor, we're all doing something kind of like this? Okay, so if we've got like a last common ancestor here that's kind of upright already, you. Okay. What kind of trait would we see here? Okay, sure. Let's say we have a knuckle walking shift here. Okay. So then we'd have to shift back. Where are we shifting back to that last common ancestor trait then? Like here?
Wait, so we're shifting. Knuckle walking?
This is what I'm saying, that I'm explaining the problem. Like I asked you guys, what's the problem here? Do you see it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, so what would make more sense if we have an upright last common ancestor? Like that's easy to explain if the tree is like orangutans, humans, and then chimps and gorillas, right? Because then you can say like, okay, they develop knuckle walking like somewhere here. But this is not what we get when we run their genetics, right? We get gorillas branching off and then chimps and humans together. So the thing you have to explain, right, is like, did we go through a knuckle walking phase and shift back if that's the last common ancestor state? Or the other thing that I've seen people argue, which I maybe kind of believe, is like, did knuckle walking arise twice? Right? Somewhere along here, you have something that's got to be convergent evolution if this tree is right, right? Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to ask.
So wait, gorillas and chimps come back as two different lineage?
Yeah, chimps are more closely related to us than gorillas by like a substantial margin.
But they're not like really close related to each other.
Right. Chimps are closer to us than they are to gorillas.
When you look at a chimp and look at a gorilla, it's the same thing.
I agree. And like part of it is that knuckle walking, right? Yeah, but like, this is in a time period where like, where we can very easily compare together, right? Because we've still got them. Yeah, and this is how it breaks out. Yeah. So this is why talking about like what was the last common ancestor doing is kind of interesting, right? Because there's a problem, right? Like, yeah. So I think so. This is part of why like the knuckle walking hypothesis, like that we evolved from a knuckle walking ancestor, does somewhat make sense because like then you can have knuckle walking ancestral here, lost in humans, but like separate, just convergence like between humans and orangutans. But we can see that our bipedalism is like adapted for something specific, and orangutan uprightness is adapted for something else. So like that's a bit more easy to understand. But we don't necessarily see evidence for that. So, open questions, which are always fun. Okay. So these are two ideas about how we evolved. A hilarious, wrong, but awesome theory is that we actually evolved as aquatic apes, right? So there are suggestions of this kind of like starting in the 30s, but some guy published a book in 1967 and this idea got popular for a while. And their idea was that the reason that we don't have fur is like the same reason we don't see like whales having fur, right? That we went through like a semi-aquatic stage where we were mostly like walking around in the water, like maybe like collecting shellfish and stuff, right? That's why this one has a crab. And so when you're in the water, if you want to hold your head above water, right, like you got to be medieval, because otherwise your head would be underwater. And I love it. It's amazing. But yeah, there's like no evidence that this has anything to do with reality, because we do see these fossils showing up in dry environments. We have like clear tracks in dry environments, in like muddy environments. We're reconstructing our fossil environments largely as like either forested or like open woodland, moving into kind of like patchy woodland, but like not. So sad, but fun. Okay, so when we are looking at the evolution of our lineage, the first place that we start to see these bipedal characteristics, and so where we're kind of starting, is something called Ardipithecus ramidus. So this is still very ape, like very ape-like, very, very much an ape. But we do start to see changes to the toe, mostly, that indicate that this was bipedal. And we also start to see kind of like trackways. So this is where we start to see bipedalism kind of evolving. So this is why I was questioning like where exactly we want to draw that arrow for the evolution. So we're starting at the base here around 6 million years ago, and you can see the first like Homo that we have here is somewhere around, you know, 2 and change, right, on this tree, right? So when you want to consider something human would depend on what you want to define as human, right? But our genus isn't going that far back, but shifts are. So we start to see these changes moving forward. So here's Ardipithecus. Then we have a large group of Australopithecines, which are very clearly bipedal, and very clearly like good bipedalism, right? There's kind of like good bipedalism and bad bipedalism, right? Like just like gorillas can walk sometimes, right? But they're not very good at it. They're not necessarily adapted for it. But we really are, like, we're really efficient energetically bipedally. Our Australopithecines are very clearly decent at bipedalism. There are multiple groups here, so sometimes they're all included in the same genus Australopithecus. We have a branch here off to the side that doesn't appear to be in our own lineage, appears to split off. Sometimes that's put in a separate genus, Paranthropus. And then we start to see our own genus splitting off around somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago. We are at time, so we will talk about modern humans and other members of the genus Homo on Wednesday. And then we will be done, which is crazy.